Winter came early to Wyoming in 1887. The first snow arrived before the cattle were fully brought down from the northern pasture, and by the second week of November, the railroad tracks outside the town of Sheridan looked like thin black scars cut through endless white earth. That was where Eleanor Whitmore stepped off the train carrying a single brown suitcase and a marriage letter folded carefully inside her coat pocket. The advertisement had been short: widowed rancher, stable home, God-fearing man, seeking wife, willing to build a quiet life in the Wyoming Territory. It had sounded practical, respectable, safe. What the advertisement failed to mention was that the ranch sat nearly 15 miles from town, hidden behind empty fields and cottonwoods, stripped bare by winter wind. It failed to mention that the man who wrote the letter rarely spoke more than a sentence at a time, and it certainly failed to mention there was only one bed inside the house. Eleanor stood beside the train platform, while steam curled around her boots, and the conductor shouted final departures into the cold morning air. The other passengers moved quickly. Families reunited. Workers gathered supplies. Children climbed wagons wrapped in blankets. But no one came toward her. For a moment she wondered if he had changed his mind. Then she saw him. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark coat dusted with snow. The rancher stood near the hitching rail beside a gray horse, one rough hand resting on the saddle horn. He looked older than she expected. Not old in years, old in exhaustion, like life had worn the edges off him, one winter at a time. His eyes found her briefly, then lowered toward the suitcase in her hand. "You're Miss Whitmore." His voice sounded deep and rough from cold air and too much silence. Eleanor straightened her gloves. "Yes." He nodded once. "Rode home's long." That was all. No smile, no welcome, no awkward attempt at kindness, only the wind moving across the station. Eleanor had imagined many things during the train ride west from Boston. She imagined a man lonely enough to place an advertisement for a wife might at least seem relieved when she arrived. But Caleb Mercer only took her suitcase gently from her hand and tied it behind the saddle wagon without another word. The ride to the ranch took nearly 2 hours. Snow drifted across the plains in silver ribbons, while the wagon wheels creaked against frozen earth. Eleanor sat wrapped in a wool blanket beside Caleb, listening to the sounds of leather harnesses and distant windmills turning slowly in the cold. He spoke only when necessary. "There's coffee in the basket if you want some." Or, "Road gets rough near the creek." Nothing more. At first, Eleanor thought him rude. Then she began noticing smaller things. When the wind shifted hard against her side of the wagon, he quietly moved the lantern closer so she would have warmth. When the horses slowed in deep snow, he stepped down to walk beside them rather than force them harder. When her blanket slipped during the ride, he pulled it back over her shoulders without looking directly at her. Kindness lived in him somewhere, buried deep. By the time they reached the ranch, evening had settled over the valley. The house stood alone beneath a pale sky, streaked blue-gray with snow clouds. It was not ugly, just tired. A weathered wooden cabin with smoke curling from the chimney, and a long porch facing empty pasture land. Beyond it stood the barn, larger than the house itself. The horses inside shifted softly, their breaths rising warm into the freezing air. Eleanor climbed down from the wagon slowly. The cold here felt different from Boston, sharper, lonelier, like the world had forgotten this place existed. Caleb carried her suitcase inside while she followed carefully behind him. The cabin smelled like pine smoke, leather, old coffee grounds, and winter coats drying near the fire. A lamp glowed softly beside the stove. There were books stacked near one wall, a rocking chair beside the fireplace, a pair of work gloves drying on a nail, evidence of a life lived quietly. Caleb removed his coat and hung it near the door. "You can eat first," he said. "Stew's still warm." Eleanor looked around carefully. One table, one stove, one bedroom door standing partially open, and through the doorway, one bed. She felt her stomach tighten. Caleb noticed the direction of her eyes. The silence that followed stretched longer than before. Outside, wind pushed softly against the cabin walls. Eleanor clasped her gloves together. "I think," she said carefully, "there's been some misunderstanding." Caleb waited. She swallowed. "I agreed to marry you eventually. I did not agree to share a bed with a stranger on the first night." The words sounded sharper once spoken aloud, but Caleb did not grow angry, did not sigh, did not defend himself. He simply stood there beside the stove while firelight moved softly across his face. Then he nodded once. "All right." That was all. He walked into the bedroom, gathered a pillow and 2 heavy blankets, then reached for his coat again. Eleanor stared at him. "You don't have to leave the house entirely. The barn's warmer than it looks." He said it plainly, almost casually, as though sleeping beside horses in winter was the most natural thing in the world. Then he opened the front door. Cold air rushed inside immediately. Eleanor watched him disappear across the snowy yard, carrying blankets beneath one arm, while lantern lights swayed beside him. A few moments later, the barn door opened, then closed, and the ranch fell silent again. Eleanor stood alone beside the fire. The guilt arrived slowly, heavy, quiet. She had expected anger, perhaps disappointment, but not this strange gentleness, not a man willing to sleep beside livestock simply because she looked frightened. That night she barely slept. The wind howled outside the cabin while tree branches scratched softly against the roof. Several times she rose from bed and crossed toward the window. The barn lantern still glowed faintly through the storm, and each time she saw it, something inside her chest tightened, because for the first time since boarding the train west, she wondered if she had misunderstood him entirely. Morning arrived pale and freezing. Eleanor woke to the smell of coffee. For a brief second, she forgot where she was. Then she noticed the empty chair near the fire, the ranch house, the snow, Wyoming. She stepped into the kitchen carefully. A fresh pot of coffee sat warming near the stove beside 2 plates of biscuits, covered with cloth to keep them warm. But Caleb was gone. Only wet boot prints remained near the door. Eleanor wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and looked outside. The sky glowed soft silver over endless fields. Near the barn, she saw Caleb already working, moving slowly through morning frost while feeding the horses. He had been awake for hours. Later that morning, he showed her the ranch without unnecessary conversation. The chicken coop, the smokehouse, the well near the north fence, the root cellar beneath the hill. His movements carried the calm efficiency of a man long accustomed to solitude. He did not explain himself much, did not try to impress her, and somehow that unsettled Eleanor more than if he had, because there was no performance in him, no charm carefully arranged for courtship, only truth, cold, quiet truth. By afternoon, Eleanor learned the frontier did not care whether someone came from Boston or Wyoming. Wood still needed splitting, water still froze in buckets, wind still slipped beneath doors, no matter how educated a woman might be. She attempted helping with supper that evening, and nearly burned the biscuits black. Caleb ate them anyway, without complaint. "I can make something else," she said, embarrassed. "They're fine. They're hard as bricks. I've eaten worse." She almost smiled despite herself. The next several days settled into uneasy rhythm. Caleb worked outside from dawn until dark. Eleanor cleaned the cabin, learned where supplies were kept, and tried adjusting to the strange silence surrounding the ranch. Back east there had always been noise, streetcars, neighbors, church bells, voices through apartment walls. But here, silence had weight. At night she could hear snow landing softly on the roof, could hear horses breathing inside the barn, could hear Caleb returning long after dark and carefully wiping mud from his boots before stepping inside. Every evening he slept beside the horses, and every morning he left fresh firewood stacked neatly outside the cabin door before sunrise. At first, Eleanor assumed it was coincidence. Then she realized the pile appeared no matter the weather. Heavy snow, freezing wind, dark mornings before dawn. The wood was always there, cut evenly, stacked carefully, dry enough to burn quickly. He never mentioned it. One afternoon, Eleanor tore the seam of her glove while hauling water from the well. It was an expensive pair from Boston, already old from years of careful use. She left them near the stove absent-mindedly that evening. The next morning, the seam had been repaired, not elegantly. The stitches looked rough and uneven, but strong enough to survive winter. Eleanor turned the glove over quietly in her hands during breakfast. "You fixed this." Caleb drank his coffee. "It was coming apart." "You sewed." A slight shrug. "Had to learn after my wife got sick." The words landed softly between them. Not dramatic, not intended to wound, simply truth spoken aloud. Eleanor lowered her eyes toward the glove. That was the first time he mentioned his wife, and somehow it made the cabin feel even lonelier than before. Days passed, then weeks. Snow gathered higher against the fences while December crept slowly across the valley. Eleanor learned how to keep coffee warm without burning it, how to patch quilts, how to close the chicken coop before coyotes wandered too near after sunset. She learned Caleb preferred silence in the mornings, but sometimes listened carefully when she read aloud near the fire at night. One evening, she discovered a small shelf of books tucked beside the bedroom wall. Most were worn from years of use: poetry, scripture, a few old novels. Inside one cover, she found a woman's handwriting, Anna Mercer, Caleb's wife. Eleanor traced the faded ink gently. She liked reading during storms. Caleb said from behind her. Eleanor turned slightly. "I didn't know you read novels." She did. The fire crackled softly between them. Eleanor held the book carefully in both hands. "You loved her very much." Caleb stared toward the flames for several seconds before answering. Yes. No speech followed, no explanation. But something in his voice lingered after the word disappeared. A grief so old it had settled permanently into the walls of the house itself. That night, Eleanor listened carefully while the wind moved across the ranch, and for the first time, she stopped thinking of herself as the loneliest person inside the cabin. A few mornings later, she woke before sunrise because of noise outside. She pulled on boots and stepped carefully onto the porch. Snowflakes drifted through pale blue darkness. Near the woodpile stood Caleb splitting logs beneath a lantern. His sleeves were rolled despite the cold, breath rising white around him. Again and again the axe struck frozen wood. Steady, rhythmic. Eleanor wrapped her shawl tighter. "You'll freeze out here." Caleb lifted another log. "House needs wood. You could wait until daylight." Another strike. Fire dies before daylight. She watched him quietly, then noticed something else. His hands, red from cold, knuckles cracked raw from winter work, and suddenly she remembered where he slept each night. Not inside, not near the fire, inside the barn beside animals, because she had once said she felt uncomfortable. Guilt moved through her again, but now it carried something warmer with it. Respect, perhaps even tenderness, though she refused to name it yet. That evening, Eleanor left an extra blanket folded beside the barn door. No note, no explanation. The next morning it was gone. Nothing was said. But when Caleb placed coffee beside her plate later that day, he added extra cream the way she liked it, and somehow that small detail felt larger than words. The weeks before Christmas settled into quiet routine. Eleanor baked bread while snow drifted outside the windows. Caleb repaired fences buried beneath ice. Sometimes he returned so exhausted he nearly fell asleep at the table before supper ended. Sometimes Eleanor read aloud near the fire while he sat nearby mending harness straps in silence. They rarely looked directly at one another during those evenings, yet the loneliness inside the cabin had begun changing shape, slowly, softly, like ice melting beneath snow where no one could see it yet. One particularly cold night, the lamp oil nearly ran out during supper. The room dimmed until only firelight remained. Eleanor laughed softly at the darkness. "In Boston," she said, "I once complained because the parlor maid forgot to light the hallway lamps." Caleb glanced toward her. "You miss it." She thought carefully before answering. The lamps, the city. Outside, the wind moved hard across the porch. Eleanor looked into the fire. "I miss knowing where I belonged." Silence followed, long, gentle. Then Caleb spoke without lifting his eyes from the coffee cup in his hands. "Most people do." That was all. But it felt strangely intimate, because for the first time, they were no longer speaking about Boston, or Wyoming, or weather. They were speaking about loneliness, and both of them understood it perfectly. Christmas came quietly to the Mercer Ranch. There were no church bells close enough to hear, no children singing in the street, no crowded parlor filled with neighbors and candles and familiar voices, only snow, wind, smoke from the chimney, and the soft, steady sound of horses shifting in the barn before dawn. Eleanor woke that morning to a silence so complete it seemed the whole world was holding its breath. For a moment she lay still beneath the quilt, watching pale blue light gather around the window frame. Back in Boston, Christmas mornings had always begun with noise. Her mother moving through the house before sunrise, her father clearing his throat in the hallway. The smell of orange peel, cinnamon, polished wood, and coal smoke. Later, after her father died, those mornings had grown smaller, quieter, colder in ways no fire could fix. But this was different. This was not the loneliness of a crowded city forgetting her. This was the loneliness of a place waiting to be filled. She dressed slowly and stepped into the kitchen. The fire was already burning. Coffee warmed on the stove, and beside her cup sat something wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. Eleanor stopped. For a long second she did not touch it. Caleb was not in the house. His boots were gone from beside the door, and beyond the frosted window she could see his shape moving near the barn, shoulders bent against the morning cold. The gift was small, almost too small to be called a gift. She sat at the table and untied the string carefully. Inside was a book, not new, not fancy, but repaired. It was one of Anna Mercer's old poetry books, the one Eleanor had held weeks earlier beside the fire. Its spine had been cracked then, its pages loose, its cover worn soft at the corners. Now the spine had been stitched back together with thin leather thread. The torn pages had been pressed flat. The cover had been cleaned as best a rancher could clean it. On the inside cover, beneath Anna's faded handwriting, Caleb had written only 4 words. "For when storms come." Eleanor placed her palm over the page. Outside, a horse snorted softly in the cold. That was the moment something in her heart shifted. Not loudly, not suddenly, There was no music, no grand declaration, no hand reaching for hers across a candlelit table, only a repaired book, a fire someone had built before she woke, and a man outside in the snow who had remembered what she touched gently weeks before. When Caleb came in for breakfast, snow clung to the shoulders of his coat. He removed his hat, shook it once near the door, and paused when he saw the book open beside her cup. Eleanor looked up. "Thank you," she said. Caleb's eyes lowered. "Wasn't much. It was—" He said nothing, but his hand stayed a moment longer than usual on the back of the chair before he sat down. For breakfast, she had made biscuits again. This time they were soft, not perfect, a little uneven, browned too much on one side, but Caleb ate 3 of them. After the meal, Eleanor rose and crossed to the shelf near the stove. From behind a stack of folded cloth, she took out a small package of her own. Caleb looked surprised. She placed it near his plate. "It is not much either." He opened it slowly, almost awkwardly, as though gifts belonged to a language he had forgotten. Inside was a wool neck scarf, dark and plain, stitched by hand over many evenings while he had sat repairing harness straps near the fire. The edges were not perfect. Eleanor knew that. She saw the places where the stitches changed size, where the thread had pulled too tight, where her Boston fingers had struggled with frontier work. But Caleb held it carefully, like something fragile. "You made this?" "Yes." He ran one thumb along the wool. Then he stood, walked to the door, and put it around his neck before reaching for his coat. Eleanor watched him. "You don't have to wear it now. It's cold." The answer was simple, but his voice was softer than usual. That afternoon, the storm began. At first, it came as thin snow blowing sideways across the yard. Caleb noticed it while carrying feed to the barn. He looked toward the northern sky and stood still for a few seconds. Eleanor saw his face through the kitchen window. Something in it changed. The storm did not look dangerous to her at first. It looked only gray and restless, like many other winter afternoons, but Caleb knew the land better than she did. He came inside, took his heavy coat from the peg, and reached for his gloves. "Need to bring the cattle closer." Eleanor turned from the stove. "Now." "Fence broke near the lower draw yesterday. If they drift north in this, we lose them. The snow is getting worse." "I know." She wanted to say more. She wanted to ask him not to go, but she had no right yet to ask such a thing. So she only said, "Take the lantern." He looked at her then, a brief glance, but enough to show he understood everything she had not said. "I will." He left before the storm turned white. By late afternoon, the world beyond the windows disappeared. Snow struck the cabin in thick, hard waves. Wind pressed against the walls until the wood groaned. The porch vanished beneath drifting powder. Even the barn, only yards away, became a dark blur behind curtains of white. Eleanor tried to keep busy. She stirred stew. She swept a floor already clean. She folded the same blanket twice. Then she stood by the window with both hands wrapped around the curtain edge. The lamp burned low. The clock ticked. The coffee pot hissed softly on the stove. Caleb did not come back. Dusk came early beneath the storm. Then darkness. Eleanor lit another lamp and placed it in the window. She remembered him saying once that a light in a window could mean more than a person thought. He had said it while fixing a hinge on the back door, almost absent-mindedly, as though speaking to himself. "Men get turned around in weather," he had said. "Sometimes a lamp's the difference." At the time, she had only nodded. Now she understood. She trimmed the wick higher. Outside, the storm swallowed everything. Hours passed. The stew grew thick. The fire burned down and had to be fed again. At one point, Eleanor opened the front door and called his name into the snow. The wind threw it back at her. "Caleb." Nothing. Only the darkness moving. Fear entered the cabin without invitation. It came quietly at first, sitting in the chair across from her, standing near the stove, waiting beside the bedroom door. Then it grew larger, until the whole house seemed filled with it. Eleanor had known many kinds of fear in her life. Fear of unpaid bills, fear of pitying glances, fear of becoming unnecessary, fear of being chosen only because she was useful. But this was different. This fear had his name. When the horse finally appeared near midnight, Eleanor heard it before she saw it. A faint sound through the storm. Hooves dragging in snow, harness leather creaking. She ran to the door and pulled it open. The cold hit her so hard it stole her breath. At the edge of the lantern light, a horse stumbled into view. Caleb was bent low over the saddle. For one terrible second, Eleanor thought he was dead. Then he moved. Barely. She rushed into the snow without coat or gloves. "Caleb." His head lifted slightly. "Got them in." His voice was almost gone. Then he slid from the saddle. Eleanor reached him before he hit the ground. He was heavier than she expected, frozen, almost stiff beneath his coat. Snow had packed into his collar and beard. His hands were so cold. They did not close around hers. Somehow she got him inside. She never knew how. Perhaps fear gave strength. Perhaps the house itself helped her. She dragged him to the chair near the fire, pulled off his gloves, then stopped when she saw his fingers, red, swollen, numb from cold. Oh, Caleb. He tried to stand. Horse. I will see to the horse. No, you cannot even stand. He looked at her with fever-bright eyes. For the first time since she had met him, he looked afraid, not for himself, for the animal outside, for the work unfinished, for the life depending on him. Eleanor understood then that this man had carried responsibility so long, he no longer knew how to lay it down. She pushed him gently back into the chair. Stay. The word came out stronger than she expected. Caleb stared at her. Then, for once, he obeyed. Eleanor wrapped a blanket around him, pulled on his old coat, and went into the storm. The horse stood trembling near the porch. She led it into the barn with clumsy hands and whispered apologies, as though the animal could understand. She found hay, rubbed snow from its neck as best she could, latched the stall, and hurried back through the white darkness. By the time she returned, Caleb was shivering violently. She boiled water, warmed cloths, pulled his boots off, fed the fire until the cabin glowed orange and gold. He drifted in and out through the night. Sometimes he muttered about cattle, sometimes about fences. Once he whispered Anna's name. Eleanor froze when she heard it. Then she placed another cool cloth on his forehead and said nothing. Grief did not frighten her anymore. She had brought enough of her own. Near dawn, when the storm finally began to weaken, Caleb stirred and spoke again. This time his voice was low, broken by fever. I did not want you afraid here. Eleanor looked at him. The words struck deeper than any confession could have. Not I needed a wife. Not I wanted someone to cook. Not I was lonely. I did not want you afraid here. Suddenly, the firewood made sense. The repaired glove. The coffee warmed before sunrise. The distance he kept. The way he slept beside the horses without complaint. The way he never entered a room too quickly. The way he gave her space, even inside his own home. He had not been cold. He had been careful. Eleanor sat slowly beside him. His hand rested on the arm of the chair, rough and cracked and still cold despite the fire. For a long moment she only looked at it. Then she placed her hand over his. Caleb did not wake fully, but his fingers moved, just enough to hold on. That was all. That was everything. By morning, the storm had passed. The ranch lay buried beneath deep white silence. Fence posts looked like half-sunken crosses along the pasture. The barn roof carried a heavy sheet of snow. The sky above it all had cleared to a hard winter blue. Caleb woke near noon. He opened his eyes slowly and found Eleanor sitting nearby with the poetry book in her lap. She had been reading aloud for nearly an hour, though she was not sure he could hear her. His gaze moved from the fire to the room to her face, then to his hand, still beneath hers. Eleanor began to pull away. Caleb's fingers tightened gently, not enough to trap her, only enough to ask. She stayed. He looked embarrassed then, as though needing comfort was something shameful. You should be resting, she said. He swallowed. The cattle, close to the barn. The horse, fed. The fire. I know how to feed a fire, Caleb. A faint look moved across his face, almost a smile. Almost. You do now. She looked back down at the book. Outside, the sun shone on the snow so brightly it filled the cabin with soft light. After a while, Caleb said, You should not have gone out in that storm. You should not have either. He had no answer, so they sat in silence. But it was not the silence of strangers anymore. It was warmer than that. In the days that followed, Caleb recovered slowly, too slowly for his liking. He hated being watched over, hated sitting inside while work waited beyond the windows. But Eleanor became quietly firm in ways that surprised them both. When he tried to stand too soon, she placed his boots across the room. When he insisted he could carry wood, she reminded him that frostbite was not improved by stubbornness. When he reached for his coat, she looked at him once, only once, and somehow he sat back down. The ranch did not fall apart without him for 3 days. That seemed to trouble him deeply. Eleanor found it almost amusing. She tended the chickens, fed the stove, checked the horse, and learned which grain bin held what. She burned one pot of oats badly enough that even the barn cats refused it. She spilled milk on the floor and slipped in it while carrying kindling. She bruised her hip on the table corner and said a word her mother would not have approved of. Caleb heard it from the chair for the first time. He laughed, not loudly, not freely, but enough. Eleanor looked toward him, startled. He covered his mouth with one hand, as though he had done something impolite. She stood there with milk on her skirt and kindling scattered around her boots. Then she laughed too. The sound filled the cabin strangely, as if the walls had been waiting years to hear it. After that, something between them changed in small, ordinary ways. Caleb still did not say much. Eleanor still kept some careful part of herself guarded, but the house began to rearrange around them. Her books found a place on the shelf. Her shawl hung beside his coat. 2 cups stayed near the stove instead of 1. At supper, Caleb began asking small questions. Not many, but enough. What did you teach back east? Children mostly. Were they difficult? Very. Worse than cattle. Cattle listen better. He looked at her over his coffee. Then the corner of his mouth moved. That became the shape of their courtship. Not flowers, not poems spoken under moonlight, not promises made too soon. Just 2 people learning where the other kept pain and choosing not to press too hard. One evening in January, Caleb stood in the bedroom doorway holding a hammer and several boards. Eleanor looked up from mending his coat. What are those for? Bookshelf. We already have a shelf. It's full. She glanced toward the corner where her books and Anna's old books had begun leaning against one another in uneven stacks. You do not need to build anything for me. I know. He carried the boards inside anyway. For the next 2 nights, he worked near the fire after chores were finished, measuring, sanding, fitting wood together with the same quiet patience he gave to horses and fences and broken things. Eleanor sat nearby, sewing by lamplight. Neither of them called it tenderness, but it was. When the shelf was finished, he placed it near the window where morning light fell across the wall. Eleanor ran her fingers over the smooth edge. It is beautiful. It will hold. She turned toward him. I said beautiful. Caleb looked uncomfortable with the word. It will still hold. She smiled. That night, before he went out to the barn, Eleanor stood near the door and gathered courage slowly. The air between them felt delicate, like thin ice over deep water. Caleb. He paused with one hand on the latch. Yes, you do not have to sleep out there tonight. The room became very still. He did not turn quickly, did not answer quickly. A log shifted in the stove, sending sparks softly against the iron. Eleanor kept her voice steady. I am not afraid of you. Caleb's shoulders rose with a slow breath, then lowered. When he turned, his face held something she had not seen before. Hope. So careful it almost looked like pain. I can sleep by the fire, he said. If you wish, I do not want you uncomfortable. I know. Those 2 words carried everything. I know now. I understand. I see you. Caleb removed his coat slowly and hung it beside hers. That night, he slept in the chair near the fire with one blanket over his knees. Eleanor lay awake in the bedroom listening. Not because she was afraid, because for the first time since arriving in Wyoming, the house did not sound empty. She heard the fire settle, the wind push against the windows, Caleb breathing softly in sleep, and beneath all of it, something quiet and steady taking root. Trust. After that, Caleb no longer slept in the barn unless a mare was near foaling, or the weather turned dangerous. He never assumed more, never crossed the space she did not offer. Some nights he slept by the fire. Some nights he rose before dawn and was gone before she woke. But every morning the wood was still stacked by the door. Every morning the coffee still waited. Every morning Eleanor found some small proof that she had been thought of before sunrise. So she began leaving proofs of her own: a mended cuff, a warmer supper, a clean shirt folded near the stove, a ribbon tied around the handle of his lunch pail so he would know which one was his on market days. At first, Caleb seemed puzzled by these things, as though care given freely required explanation. Then slowly he accepted them, not with speeches, with quieter gestures. He started bringing wild branches from the creek bottom because he had once seen her put dried flowers in a jar. He fixed the loose board near the bed because she always stepped around it. He carved a small wooden peg beside the door, exactly the right height for her hat. He did not say he loved her. He split wood before sunrise. He warmed the milk before she asked. He stood on the porch until she returned from the chicken coop in blowing snow. And Eleanor, who had once believed love was a promise spoken elegantly in parlors, began learning another language. The language of boots left outside so mud would not cross her clean floor, of coffee poured before words, of a man lowering his voice when grief entered a room, of someone making space for her without asking her to become smaller. By late February, the worst of winter began loosening its grip. Icicles melted slowly from the barn roof. The road to town opened again. A neighbor came by with news and stayed for coffee, looking curiously between Caleb and Eleanor. So, the man said, married life. Treating you fair. Eleanor stiffened slightly. Caleb noticed. He set his cup down. We are doing fine. The answer was calm, but firm. The neighbor looked from one to the other and seemed to understand he had reached the edge of what would be discussed. After he left, Eleanor stood at the sink washing cups too long. Caleb remained near the table. "I should have corrected him," she said. Caleb was quiet. Then, "Did you want me to?" She turned. His face was unreadable, but his hands were tense. Eleanor looked down at the cup in her hands. She thought of the train station, the single bed, the barn lantern glowing through snow, the book repaired for storms, his fevered voice whispering that he had not wanted her afraid. "I don't know," she said honestly. Caleb nodded. There was disappointment in the nod, but not anger. Never anger. "I will. Next time." He reached for his hat. That hurt more than she expected. "Caleb." He stopped. She wanted to say something. Something clear, something kind enough to make up for the uncertainty in her voice, but the words frightened her, so she said the only true thing she could. "I am still learning how to stay." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then his expression softened. "Well," he said, "the road is still muddy. No train leaving today." It was not a confession, but it made her smile, and it kept her from crying. Spring came slowly, not like a miracle, like work. Snow became mud, mud became grass. The creek broke free beneath the ice and ran silver through the pasture. Calves began appearing on uncertain legs. The hens started laying again. Eleanor opened windows during the day and let cold, clean air move through rooms that had held winter too long. She washed curtains, beat rugs on the porch, set Anna's poetry book beside her own instead of hidden away. Caleb watched these changes quietly. At first, the house looked strange with Eleanor's touch inside it. A jar of wildflowers on the table, a blue cloth over the breadbasket, a row of books standing straight in the new shelf. Then it stopped looking strange. It began looking finished. One afternoon, Caleb came in from the barn and found Eleanor standing on a chair, trying to hang a small framed print above the bookshelf. The chair wobbled. He crossed the room quickly and steadied it with both hands. She looked down at him. "I had it. I know. You still came." "Yes." Their eyes met. The moment was brief, but something passed through it, a truth too quiet for speech. Eleanor stepped down slowly. Caleb did not move away at once. For the first time, they stood close enough that she could see the small scar near his jaw, the one partly hidden by his beard, close enough to smell cold air and hay on his coat, close enough to realize she was no longer afraid of the space between them disappearing. Caleb lowered his eyes first, gentleman enough to give her room, lonely enough that it cost him. That evening, Eleanor made stew the way he liked it, thicker, with more pepper. She placed 2 bowls on the table and waited until he came inside. He looked surprised to find her sitting there, hands folded, supper untouched. "You didn't have to wait." "I wanted to." He removed his hat slowly. Such a small sentence, and yet for Caleb Mercer, it was nearly everything. Summer followed spring. By then, people in town had stopped wondering whether Eleanor would leave. She rode beside Caleb in the wagon on market days now. She spoke with the grocer, chose flour carefully, bought thread, lamp oil, coffee, and once, a packet of seeds for flowers she said might not survive Wyoming wind. Caleb built a small fence around a patch near the porch anyway. The flowers grew poorly at first, then stubbornly, like most living things on the frontier. Some evenings, after supper, Eleanor read aloud while Caleb sat on the porch steps sharpening tools. Sometimes he listened. Sometimes he only watched the far pasture turn gold beneath sunset. But she knew he heard her, because days later he would mention some small line from the book, as though it had been waiting in him. Once, after she read a passage about home, Caleb looked toward the fields and said, "Never thought much about that word, home." He nodded. "What did you think this place was?" He leaned his elbows on his knees. "Work." Eleanor looked at the cabin, the porch, the lamp, the woodpile, the barn breathing softly in the dusk. And now, Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then he looked at her. Different. That was all. That was enough. Autumn returned with amber grass and colder mornings. Almost 1 year had passed since Eleanor stepped off the train. The memory of that first night still lived between them, but it no longer hurt the same way. Sometimes, when the horses shifted in the barn after dark, Eleanor would glance toward Caleb and find him already looking at her with quiet amusement. Neither mentioned it often, until the first snow of the new winter began falling. Eleanor stood on the porch watching white flakes drift over the yard. Caleb came up behind her carrying firewood. He stacked it neatly beside the door, just as he always had. She looked at the pile. "You know," she said, "I never asked you to keep doing that. I know. You could stop." He placed the last log carefully. "I know." She turned toward him. "Then why don't you?" Caleb brushed wood dust from his gloves. For a moment, she thought he would avoid the question. Then he looked out across the ranch. toward the barn where he had spent so many cold nights because of her fear. "When you first came," he said slowly, "I didn't know what to give you." Eleanor waited. I had no fine words, no easy way, no promise that wouldn't sound like asking too much. His voice stayed low, steady, so I gave you wood. Snow fell between them, softly, endlessly. Eleanor felt her eyes sting. Caleb looked at her then, almost apologetic. "Still seems useful." A laugh broke through her tears, small and trembling. "Yes," she whispered, "very useful." That night she did not read aloud. They sat beside the fire in companionable quiet, the kind that belongs only to people who have stopped performing for one another. After a long while, Eleanor reached across the small space between their chairs and placed her hand palm up on the armrest. Caleb looked at it, then at her. His hand settled over hers carefully. Warm, rough, certain. No vow was spoken. No grand promise filled the room. Only the fire, the snow, the coffee pot waiting for morning, and two people who had found their way to one another slowly enough for trust to arrive first. A week later, Caleb rode into town alone. He returned near dusk with supplies, a sack of flour, lamp oil, nails, coffee beans, and one small item wrapped in cloth tucked inside his coat pocket. He seemed more silent than usual during supper. Eleanor noticed. Of course, she noticed everything now. The way he stirred his coffee without drinking it, the way he looked toward the shelf, then the fire, then down at his hands. Finally, she set her fork down. "Caleb." He looked up. "Did something happen in town?" "No." "Did someone say something?" "No." "Did you forget something?" A pause. "No." She studied him. "Then why do you look like a man about to face a hanging?" He blinked. Then, unexpectedly, smiled. Only a little, but enough to change his whole face. I was trying to find words. Eleanor's heart quieted, not stopped, quieted, as though some part of her already knew. Caleb reached into his coat and placed the cloth bundle on the table between them. Inside was a ring, plain gold, small, not polished brightly, the kind of ring a rancher would choose, because it was honest and would last. Eleanor stared at it. Caleb kept his hands folded near his plate. "I know how this began," he said, "and I know I did not give you much reason to trust it." Her eyes lifted to him. "I wrote for a wife because I thought a house needed one. I was wrong." He swallowed once. "A house can stand empty for years and still be a house." The fire cracked softly. "But a home." His voice roughened. He looked down, then back up. "A home is someone staying when they could leave." Eleanor could not speak. Caleb did not rush her. He never rushed her. "I am not asking because of the letter," he said, "or the arrangement, or what people in town think." He pushed the ring gently toward her. "I'm asking because I would be grateful to spend the rest of my winters making sure you are warm." Tears gathered before she could stop them. Not dramatic tears, not broken ones, the quiet kind that come when the heart realizes it is safe. Eleanor looked at the man across from her, the man she had feared, the man she had misjudged, the man who had slept beside horses rather than make her feel trapped, the man who had built shelves for her books, warmed coffee before dawn, fixed gloves, carried grief without turning it cruel, and loved her in 100 ways before ever asking for anything in return. She picked up the ring, then looked at him. "I think," she said softly, "I started staying long before you asked." Caleb's eyes lowered. When he looked back at her, there was something shining in them. He did not say "I love you." He did not need to. He stood, came around the table, and waited. Eleanor offered him her hand. He placed the ring on her finger with such care that it felt less like claiming and more like shelter. Outside, snow moved across the dark windows. Inside, the cabin held its breath. Then Eleanor smiled. "You may sleep in the bedroom now, Mr. Mercer." Caleb looked at her, startled. Then his ears turned red. Eleanor laughed, and after a moment, so did he. Years later, people in Sheridan still told the story wrong. They said Eleanor Whitmore had come west as a mail-order bride and married Caleb Mercer because frontier women had few choices. But those who knew them best understood the truth. Eleanor had choices. She chose the quiet man who never once made her fear his wanting. She chose the ranch where winter was harsh, but the fire was always lit before she woke. She chose the porch where sunsets spilled gold over the pasture. She chose the barn where horses breathed warm clouds into cold air. She chose the table with 2 coffee cups, the shelf built by hand, the patch of stubborn flowers near the porch, the life that did not arrive grandly, but gently. Year after year, the Mercer Ranch changed. A new room was added to the house, then another. A cradle eventually stood near the same fireplace where Caleb had once slept in a chair through winter nights. Children learned to walk between the kitchen table and the wood box. Eleanor taught them letters with chalk on slate. Caleb taught them how to approach horses without fear. On storm nights, Eleanor still read aloud, sometimes to the children, sometimes to Caleb, sometimes only to the room itself. And every winter morning, before dawn, Caleb rose quietly, even when his beard turned gray, even when his hands grew stiff, even when his sons were old enough to split the wood themselves. He still went outside before the sun touched the pasture, still lifted the axe, still stacked the logs beside the door. One morning, many years later, Eleanor stood behind the curtain watching him. Snow fell softly over his shoulders. His movements were slower now, but the care remained unchanged. When he came inside, she was waiting with coffee. "You know," she said, smiling, "I'm not afraid of the cold anymore." Caleb hung his coat by the door. "I know, you do not have to keep leaving wood there." He looked at her, older now, quieter, perhaps, but with the same steady eyes she had first misunderstood at the train station. Then he said, "I know," and the next morning, the wood was there again, because that was how Caleb Mercer loved, not loudly, not perfectly, but faithfully. And Eleanor, who had once crossed half a continent, afraid she had been purchased into loneliness, found instead a man who made room for her fear, then waited patiently while it became trust. She had refused his bed on the first night, so he slept beside the horses, and in doing so, he gave her the first gift she had not known how to ask for: safety. From that safety came warmth, from warmth came belonging, and from belonging came love, the kind that does not need to announce itself, the kind that stacks firewood before dawn, the kind that turns a lonely ranch house into home. If this story stayed with you, tell me in the comments. When do you think Eleanor first realized Caleb loved her? Was it the repaired book, the night of the storm, or the morning she understood why the firewood was always waiting by the door? And if you want another quiet frontier love story about two lonely souls who found home in each other, the next story is waiting for you right here.